Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. I probably should have said last recording. I probably should have warned the listenership to this particular recording that even though the best laid plans, I'm looking at my podcasting table, I still have 4 or so boxes on the floor, and I have a stack of, I don't even know what it is, Necromunda rules, which I think I'll probably give on to someone that is still on the podcasting table. This is after a few evenings worth of work over the week. So my hope is, this being Sunday morning, that I might, as I'm editing Model Rail Radio through today, deal with these final boxes and maybe just post a photograph of a clean podcasting table for Sunday evening, perhaps, let us say, maybe. Let us aim for that, folks listening in. So the nature of the internet as a phenomena tends to be that there is no formalism to anything. In fact, if you want to try to create formalism to any phenomena that would occur on the internet, you'll learn very quickly that you better just do it in the way that you do it. See, actually, most recently, what's it called? Anchor? For more on that. So anyway, I have found on YouTube a variety of folk who are using the shutdown period to play games solo without any rules modifications. And I think it's actually really interesting to watch people play games where they're playing both sides without rules modifications at all, because what you start to see is some of the curious nuances of solo gameplay that are rarely talked about. So I thought I would devote a good portion of this podcast to talk about some of that, so at least those of us that listen to this particular podcast might be slightly mindful of this phenomena. But I've seen it in a wide variety of different areas. My longtime friend through Model Rail Radio, Bernie Kopinski, has been filming some solo wargaming efforts through the bolt action rules. And although the breakdown of I Go, You Go breaks up some of this, you still end up with circumstances where you can see pretty clearly in a solo play which side is being particularly favored. Now, this is always the difficulty with regards to solo play, is it is possible to come to this thing with a very neutral perspective that, you know, you're playing both sides and you'll see what will happen. But it is relatively easy to incidentally work in one's biases and one's preferences, so the side that one wants to win does eventually win. Now, this isn't a real phenomena. I mean, this needs to be called out specifically. If solo play is strictly for just the joy of setting up models, rolling dice, and having a game, that's fine. More power to you. Enjoy that. But I think what interests me through the notion of solo play, there are a series of historical books associated with solo wargaming, usually written by people in the UK. I think all universally are pretty darn horrible. I've read many of them. I see many of them, in fact, on my shelves now, neatly organized. Well, maybe not as neatly organized as I'd want, but still, there's time. So I want to discard a lot of this discussion that these books normally get into with regards to this kind of stuff, because I think, in general, the rules have changed dramatically. In fact, this is one of the things that I wanted to do, maybe I'll do next weekend, is actually go through existing rule systems. I was going to look at probably the Age of Chivalry, Warhammer Ancient Battles rules, and potentially like 3rd edition, potentially Rogue Trader, yes, a bunch of GW rule systems with the idea of solo play in mind. Just as like more interesting, perhaps long-form videos to just talk about the thinking in a more leisurely format. But unfortunately, with 4 hours of Model Rail Radio to edit this afternoon, I don't really have that leisurely format here. So let's talk about a couple of phenomena. If you can identify your own biases, so much the better. Like, if you want the British to win every single time, or the Americans, or, you know, the Russians, or the Germans, or whatever, then start thinking about a rule of maybe 2 versus 3, or even 1 versus 2, or even 1 versus 3, associated with points or individual models, or whatever way you want to create the bias to make the parameters of victory that much more difficult in the direction of bias that you want to take. And I think this is a really important idea. I think this goes back to the whole nature. I mean, what you want from solo wargaming is a phenomena called emergence. And emergence means that the rules as written do not give you back everything. It's the idea of a gestalt, that there is more in there with all these components together than is there just by the rules alone. You want to be surprised. You want wonder to come out of this. Your solo experience should be just as pleasurable, maybe not quite just, but as close as pleasurable as playing against another opponent as possible. And once you start identifying your own bias, and sometimes this is the nature of the fact that I have, for no fault of my own, vastly more Imperial Guard, for example, than anything else. Because there was a period of time when I was in the UK when the Steel Legion box sets were out, and I'd buy Steel Legion box sets like boxes of chocolate, and the rest writes itself. So my view is that if I were to play a game with Steel Legion, I would realize implicitly, even if I thought in my possible best intentions that there would be not a reason for making the Steel Legion that much more victorious, I would make sure, just based on my sheer model count bias, that there was a 1 versus 3 ratio of models between the Steel Legion and probably Chaos or the Orcs. Probably the Orcs. And that bias would then completely change the dynamics of the game and force me to play on the back foot with regards to a force that I was slightly more, Greenskins, hard to tell. But anyway, slightly more biased towards, perhaps by sheer model count alone. Although, honestly, now with Greenskins, I think maybe the model count is getting closer. A future video, no doubt. Anyway, so the idea here is that you acknowledge your own bias and you counteract these biases. Anyway, you counteract this stuff by putting more against than for in the direction that you want to go. Another option is randomness. And I'm in two minds with regards to randomness. My view is that if you do stark biases against this force that you would want to normally win, then you could probably get around this. But let's throw randomness in there as well. The ability to have second and third waves of troops just waiting in anticipation. This is the quintessential kind of Space Hulk problem that the Gene Stealers never actually run out. This is an interesting dynamic that you can add as well. In particular, if you've got the model count, you can have, waves that are in fact contributed by the previous dead, that are kind of additive as well. And if you're interested in solo play for longer time frames, then I think these kind of ways of doing it, staggering forces as they come in, is a really interesting way to play solo. The nuances of rule systems, that's the elephant in the room here. This is something that I really wanted to do through video. I might do them in audio podcasts, but it's a lot more long-winded. It's a lot more time-consuming. I think it lends itself slightly better to video because you can actually point to rules as opposed to having to read them out. But I think certainly every rule system conceivable has got implicit biases against solo play. There are a few rule systems that specifically have solo roleplay options or solo play options, but my view with regards to those rule systems is give them the suspect eye. Because there are a number of nuances here that I have in my own judgment that these rule systems very rarely tick. For example, if you were completely and utterly biased, if you did rerolls and a variety of other things, if even strategically you took a weaker position with regards to one of the forces, which I think is kind of instinctively what I'm talking about here, that you will instinctively, make one force make slightly different, rallying points and this kind of stuff versus another force, and that in and of itself will contribute to the ultimate outcome. You shouldn't think of solo wargaming as a film. You shouldn't think of it in terms of just, giving predetermined, unless of course you want to do that. Let's be fair about this. But you should think about it that there are potentials for chaos and nuance that you cannot yet suspect. Now, the dice alone give some of that, don't get me wrong. But I think the nature of human perceptive bias is a very interesting thing. I saw recently the film 1917, and I have to say it's a remarkably good film. I also went back and watched Ninth Company, which is available on Amazon Prime. I normally wouldn't recommend things on Amazon Prime, but it is available on Amazon Prime. It's the number 9 Company, which is an account of the end of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and a complete and utter, maybe not disproportionate, because when you look at technology and these kind of things, maybe there is a proportionality, and certainly with tanks and gunships and all this stuff, but just a small number of Russians on atop a mountain being attacked wave after wave after wave of Afghan fighters and CIA folk as well, which is one of the things that I really love about Ninth Company. Beautiful example of accurately remembering the fact that they weren't all just Afghan fighters there. there are a few CIA folk doing their thing as well, which is really fascinating to see in this kind of film. So Ninth Company, a favourite film of mine for this reason. 1917. This is an example of what I do in role-playing games. 1917 represents perfectly the drive associated with free choice within a certain realm. The history of this thing, and apparently it is accurately, or at least based on stories that the, fellow who made the film's grandfather told him about the First World War. The nature of two plus or minus people making their way through a deserted battlefield, aside from occasional incidental, interactions, to give the broad flavour of here the First World War, but in a very constrained, very nuanced, very story-oriented setting, is basically the way I GM role-playing games in general as well, or at least D&D historically, when I'm dealing with a large group of people that want to have a certain experience, but also the vector of death, let's just say, is not as great as if they were just, going over the top and running across, Flanders. So my perspective with regards to 1917 is it is a beautiful film. It is aesthetically amazing. It has a lot of subtle nuances. The uniforms are a little bit clean, but, let's move on from that. I think compared to all the recent other things that have been made, things like Dunkirk, for example, or Midway, this is a film that I would certainly rate a lot more because it gives the sublime nuance to this thing a little bit better than I think Dunkirk really didn't do that. It was quite striking how poorly Dunkirk did for that. And let's not even mention Finest Hour. Anyway, so out of all these films that have been produced recently, I thought 1917 was really well done, but it was an example of my D&D archetype where you wander, players through an environment where in normal circumstances they would be completely obliterated by shells, but practically it provides an interesting story with a few counterpoints of action, which obviously the film has. But I thought that was a really interesting example. When I watched it, I was like, this is my D&D game played out in film form. So if you're interested in that kind of juxtaposing of ideas, I would certainly recommend 1917 accordingly. And also Ninth Company. I think Ninth Company, and here, Ninth Company does have a problem, which you get into with these kind of films, where the enemy is pretty well faceless aside from the occasional CIA operative. And they just appear and, they're just a constant wave of, Zulu-esque. And there are other films like Zulu that have that phenomena. But this thing, I would say, is more interesting associated with not just strategy or the lack of strategy, the chaos of war, but just a really interesting representation. And the history of it is slightly different. A few more people survived from what I've read. But you just get this sense of being completely and utterly overwhelmed for a long period of time, which my impression of warfare is that, we periodically find ourselves in, is very much this idea from an infantry standpoint. So Ninth Company I'd recommend, 1917, for different reasons I'd recommend. If you're looking for films to watch while you bunker down through this period. The outcome of this period mainly has just been more model rail radio recordings for me currently, and a lot more work. So my hope is that my podcasting table will be clean by this afternoon, having done a lot of editing on model rail radio, and going out and getting a walk and putting some of the chilies outside. I grow chilies in my podcasting room as well. Chilies and, what are they called? Microgreens, which is an interesting juxtaposition. Anyway, I hope you're all staying safe and well. Please do get in correspondence with me. One thing I wanted to say, I got this email from a fellow, I'm assuming it was a fellow, who used a pseudonym and basically maybe not have even heard this podcast. Maybe, he must have in order to find my email address, I'm assuming. If you get in contact with me, I'm all about real names. Pseudonyms, clearly fun on Anchor and other places, but yeah, I'm an adult. Please use your real name. Please introduce yourself. I do enjoy receiving email and I do enjoy receiving correspondence from people, but I like a particular kind of framing. And if you contact me with a pseudonym and a link through to some game you want me to play, it isn't going to go too far. Anyway, in contrast to that, thanks to everyone who has emailed me real emails through this period of time. And yeah, my hope is actually to record with a couple of familiar voices. Matthew Gibson, I think, is bunkered down. Got an email from Chris Abbott as well, similarly bunkered down. my hope is to inject at least one of them back into this recording, get some insights of what they're doing through lockdown, how they're surviving. Matthew Gibson was looking for ways to do historical wargaming without miniatures, which I think I recorded in one of the bonus recordings. Anyway, Tom Barbalet, surviving in the Bay Area, signing out.